My wife had been gone for exactly 11 days when my son-in-law changed the locks on her studio. Not our house, not his house. Her studio, the little detached garage at the back of the property that Carol had spent 30 years converting into the most beautiful ceramic workshop you've ever seen. Kiln in the corner, shelves floor to ceiling packed with her pieces, the smell of clay and linseed oil baked into every wall. It was hers. It was the only place on earth that smelled like her. And on the 11th day after I buried my wife of 41 years, my son-in-law Garrett had a locksmith come out and swap the deadbolt. He didn't tell me. He didn't ask me. He texted my daughter, and my daughter, who was still so deep in her own grief she could barely get off the sofa, texted me to let me know. I stood in my backyard in January, coat half buttoned, staring at my key didn't fit anymore. I knocked. Nothing. I called Garrett's cell. Voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. The third time he picked up, and what he said to me, I've replayed it maybe 1,000 times since, and it still hits like cold water every single time. He said, the studio has significant value as a rental property. Carol would have wanted us to be practical. Carol. Her name in his mouth like that. Like he knew her. Like he had any idea what she would have wanted. I said, Garrett, my wife's ashes are still on the mantle. He said, I understand this is emotional for you, but the property is in both names now. We need to think about the future. And then he hung up. I want to be honest with you, because that's the only way this story makes any sense. I'm 67 years old. I'm a retired civil engineer from Hamilton, Ontario. I coached minor hockey for 22 years. I volunteered with the food bank every second Saturday for a decade. I have never in my life raised my hand to anyone, never screamed at anyone, never done anything that most people would call dramatic. I'm not that kind of man. But standing in that backyard, watching the January wind lift a dusting of snow off the cedar fence, Carol planted the summer our youngest started university. Something happened in my chest, something closed, something that had been open my whole life. Some door I didn't even know was there. It shut, and I thought, all right then, let me tell you about Carol first, because you need to understand what we built and why it mattered. We met in 1982 at a house party in Dundas. She was studying art history at McMaster. I was in my second year of engineering. She had a laugh that made strangers turn around in restaurants, just to see who was having that much fun. We got married in 1984 in a backyard ceremony. Her parents threw together with $60 and a borrowed tablecloth. We had 2 kids. Our son Wesley, who lives in Vancouver now and is one of the best human beings I have ever known. And our daughter Brianna, who married Garrett 8 years ago, in a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake on a day that cost us $40,000 and felt like the happiest afternoon of our lives. Carol started making ceramics seriously about 15 years ago. Before that, it was a hobby, Saturday classes at a community center, a small wheel in the basement. But when the kids were grown and the house got quiet, something in her opened up. She took courses. She found a teacher she loved, a woman in Elora named Dottie, who pushed her hard and told her she had real instinct. Carol started selling pieces at the Dundas Farmers Market, then at a studio collective in Burlington, then at a gallery in Toronto's Distillery District that reached out to her after seeing her work online. By the time she got sick, she was making $12,000 to $18,000 a year from her ceramics. Not a fortune, but real money. Money that meant something because she'd earned every dollar of it herself. More than that, it was her identity, her joy. The thing that lit her face up when she talked about it. The studio was my gift to her for her 58th birthday. I hired a contractor. We insulated the garage properly, ran electrical, put in the ventilation the kiln needed, built the shelving together on a long weekend in October. She cried when she saw it. I mean really cried, the way people cry when they feel seen. That studio was built with my hands and my money and every bit of love I had for her. Carol was diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the spring of 3 years ago. She fought it for 22 months. I'm not going to linger in that part of the story, because the grief of it is still too close, and because anyone who has sat beside someone they love through that kind of fight already knows what I'm not saying. What I will tell you is that she was brave in a way I don't have words for. She kept working in the studio until 4 months before the end. She glazed pieces lying on a folding cot her friends set up next to the wheel because she couldn't stand for long anymore. During that time, Garrett was around a lot. He and Brianna had bought a place in Oakville 2 years before. A townhouse, nice enough, but tight. Garrett worked in commercial real estate. He had the vocabulary of a man who thought about property values the way most people think about the weather, constantly, reflexively, always calculating. He would come over for Sunday dinners, and his eyes would move around the house in a way I can only describe as appraising. I noticed it. I didn't say anything, because Brianna loved him, and Carol loved Brianna, and Sunday dinners were sacred. What I didn't know, what Carol didn't tell me until 3 weeks before she died, was that Garrett had been talking to her alone, separately, during visits when I was out getting groceries or picking up her prescriptions. He had been telling her that when the time came, she should make sure Brianna was protected, that Brianna deserved security, that as the only daughter, she had a special claim. He'd used language like family equity and fair division, and Wesley has his career in Vancouver. Carol told me this in the kitchen one Tuesday evening, and I remember she looked exhausted and also furious in the quiet way she got furious when something offended her sense of decency. She said, "He's been working on me, Barry. Barry, that's me." Barry Sutherland, retired engineer, amateur woodworker, 67 years old, standing in my kitchen while my wife told me that my son-in-law had been lobbying her for our assets while she was dying. She said she hadn't changed anything. She said she didn't want me to make trouble while she was still here. She said, "But I wanted you to know so that when I'm gone, you're not caught off guard." She knew him better than I did, even then. Carol passed on a Tuesday morning, in November, at home, with Brianna and Wesley and me in the room. She went quietly, which I'm grateful for. The funeral was the following Saturday. 140 people came. Her ceramics teacher Dottie drove 3 hours from Elora. 3 separate galleries sent flowers. On day 11, Garrett changed the locks. By day 14, I had called my lawyer. Her name is Patricia Okafor, and she's been handling our wills and family legal matters for 16 years. I sat across from her in her office on King Street, and I told her everything. The conversations Carol had described, the studio, the locks, and the thing I hadn't told anyone yet. 3 days after Carol's passing, I had gone to check the joint account we kept for household expenses, and $14,000 had been moved out of it into an account I didn't recognize. Patricia went very still the way she does when something concerns her. She said, "Do you know who made that transfer?" I said, "Garrett has Brianna's banking login. I know because she mentioned it once. She said it was easier for him to handle the bills." Patricia said, "We're going to need to look at this carefully." What came out over the next 3 weeks was methodical and ugly. Garrett, using Brianna's joint access to a household account that Carol and Brianna had shared for incidental expenses, groceries when Garrett was away, gift cards for the grandchildren, that kind of thing, had moved money 6 separate times over the previous 14 months. Not massive amounts each time. 2,000 here, 3,500 there, but totaling just over $22,000. He'd been doing it while Carol was sick. He had also, Patricia discovered, filed paperwork with the municipality regarding the studio's potential conversion to a rental unit before Carol died. He had inquired about a variance for a secondary dwelling. He had done this without telling anyone, without any authority to do so. When I found out about the money, I sat in my car in Patricia's parking lot for 20 minutes and didn't move. I was trying to be honest with myself about what I was feeling. It wasn't just anger. It was something older and colder than anger. It was the feeling of someone having reached into the most sacred part of your life and helped themselves while your back was turned, while Carol was sick, while she was lying on that cot next to her wheel, glazing pieces with hands that shook. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table where Carol and I had eaten breakfast together for 35 years. I made a list. The next morning I made 4 phone calls. The first call was to Patricia to authorize her to pursue recovery of the transferred funds and to send a formal notice to Garrett regarding the studio property. The second call was to our financial advisor to initiate a complete separation of any accounts that had any shared access with Brianna or Garrett, and to begin the process of restructuring the estate according to what Carol had actually put in her will, which, as it turned out, had been written clearly and precisely and left the studio and all its contents solely to me. The third call was to Wesley in Vancouver. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "Dad, I'm buying a flight." He was there by Thursday. The fourth call was to Garrett. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me. He sounded confident. He said, "Barry, I was actually going to call you today. I think we should sit down and talk about a path forward with the property." I said, "Garrett, I've instructed my lawyer to begin legal proceedings regarding the funds removed from Carol's household account. You'll be receiving a letter by end of week." Silence. I said, "I've also notified the municipality that the studio variance inquiry was made without authorization from the property owner and should be considered withdrawn." More silence. I said, "And I want you to understand something. Carol told me 3 weeks before she died what you'd been saying to her when you visited alone. She told me because she wanted me to be prepared. She always thought of me first, right to the end. That's the kind of woman she was. I thought you should know she saw you clearly," he said. "And I want to get this exactly right," he said. "You have no idea how much Brianna has sacrificed for your family. You've always put your own feelings ahead of your children's security. This is why your daughter came to me for support instead of coming to you." I took a breath. I said, "I'll let my lawyer do the talking from here," and I hung up. The legal process took 7 months. The recovered funds, $22,460, came back to the estate with interest, after Garrett's own lawyer apparently advised him that contesting it would go badly. He signed a formal acknowledgement. There was no criminal referral, because Patricia felt civil recovery was cleaner and faster. I didn't push for more than that. I'm not interested in destroying anyone. I'm interested in what's right. The studio I had rekeyed the same week. I went in for the first time since Carol's death on a gray Wednesday morning in February. Wesley standing in the doorway behind me. Her last pieces were still on the shelves. 14 bowls in her signature blue-green glaze, the one she'd developed herself over 2 years of testing. A mug she'd been finishing the week she had to stop. A small vase I'd never seen before, maybe 8 inches tall, with a carved pattern of birds along the shoulder. I stood in there for a while. Wesley didn't say anything. He's good at that. Eventually I said, "I don't know what to do with all of this." He said, "You don't have to figure it out today." He was right. I didn't. What I did figure out, over the following months, was that I wanted something permanent to come from all of it. Not permanent in the way anger is permanent, sitting in you like a stone. Permanent in the way that things built with love are permanent. I reached out to Dottie in Elora. She's in her 70s, still teaching, still sharp. I asked her if she thought there was a community of young ceramicists in Ontario who lacked access to proper equipment and workspace. She laughed and said, "Barry, they're everywhere. The wait lists for studio time at community kilns run 8 to 12 months in this province." We started talking. Over the spring, with Wesley's help and Patricia's guidance, I established the Carol Sutherland Ceramic Arts Fund, a registered charitable foundation under the Canada Revenue Agency, which means donations are tax deductible, and the thing has structure that will outlast me. The fund provides subsidized studio access and materials grants to emerging ceramic artists in Ontario, with priority given to artists over 40 who are coming to the craft later in life, the way Carol did. The studio in my backyard is now used by fund recipients on a rotating basis. I rebuilt the shelving, replaced the kiln elements, put a small sign on the door with Carol's name on it. On the first Saturday of every month, a different artist comes and works in there all day. I usually stay in the house. Sometimes I make coffee and bring it out. We don't talk much, but I like knowing the wheel is turning. Now, about Brianna. This is the part of the story I've had to think about the longest. And I want to be honest here the way I've tried to be honest throughout. My daughter did not steal from us. She is not Garrett. She is a woman who loved a man who turned out to be calculating in ways she didn't fully see, and she is someone who is now living with the consequences of that. Including the fact that when everything came out, when Patricia's letter arrived, and Garrett had to explain to her where $22,000 had gone, it was Brianna who called me, not to defend him, not to attack me. She called me from her car in a parking lot in Oakville and she said, "Dad, I didn't know." I believed her. I still believe her. What I said to her was, "I know you didn't," she cried, a long time. Then she said, "Mom would be so angry." I said, "Your mother was already angry." She told me. That landed hard. I heard her pull in a breath. I said, "She also told me she loved you." Not once. She told me that all the time, right to the end. That part didn't change. Brianna and Garrett separated 8 months after Carol died. The divorce was finalized this past spring. She's living in a rental in Burlington now, close enough that we see each other on Sundays. She came to the foundation launch in April. She helped me hang a photograph of Carol in the studio, the one from her first Distillery District show, where she's standing next to a 5-foot installation piece she'd spent 4 months building, and she's grinning like she can't believe this is her actual life. That grin. That's what I'm working to preserve. Not the legal victory. Not the money. That grin. There's a young woman who comes on the first Saturday now, a ceramicist from Brantford named, well, I'll let her tell her own story. She's in her mid-40s, picked up clay 3 years ago after her kids grew up. Exactly the kind of artist Carol's fund is meant for. Last month she fired her first stoneware vase in the kiln, and when I brought her coffee she showed me the glaze she was testing. Blue-green. Not identical to Carol's, but in the same family. I didn't say anything about that. I just nodded and said it looked beautiful. She said, whoever built this kiln really knew what they were doing. I said, my wife picked it out. She had better equipment instincts than I did for anything that wasn't structural. She said, she sounds wonderful. I said, she was the best person I ever knew. And then I went back inside, and I made another cup of coffee, and I sat at the kitchen table where we'd had breakfast together for 35 years. And outside the window, the backyard was starting to go green, the way it does every April in Hamilton, and the light was coming through the studio window the way it always did in the mornings. That particular pale Ontario spring light that Carol used to say was the best light of the year for seeing color clearly. She was right about that too. She was right about most things. That's the whole story. I don't have a tidy lesson to close with. I'm 67 years old and I've learned to be suspicious of tidy lessons. What I can tell you is that grief will make you vulnerable in ways you don't anticipate, and that there are people in this world who will see that vulnerability and decide it's an opportunity. And I can tell you that you don't have to accept that. You are allowed to stand in your backyard in January with your key that doesn't fit anymore and decide, all right then. You're allowed to make a list, and sometimes, if you're lucky, that list becomes something that outlasts the hurt. Something with a sign on the door and a wheel that keeps turning and a light in the window that Carol would have recognized as exactly right.